We're having a great chat on our own.
we just started without y'all. I'm so sorry. So rude. Okay, so back to the beginning. We are going to be talking about consent, surveillance, and what happens when we bring these devices into our homes, kind of what happens that might be unintentional. It might be intentional, but I prefer to think that people are mostly good. And I have Mark Rolston, who is the Chief Creative Officer at Argo Designs here. Hi, Mark.
Hi.
Okay, and we are going to have Erica Olsen, who is the Director of Saftey Net at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. But these technical difficulties are still happening, so we're waiting around for Erica. So I don't know. I've been very excited. Yeah, I've been very excited about this talk because probably 2 years ago, the New York Times did a story where they actually talked to Erica about people using connected devices in the home to surveil their spouses, kids, partners, anyone, and to use it to make them feel less safe, to coerce them into things. And I had not thought about the devices that I talk about every day and love being used for something like that, and thought about how should we prevent this. So what we're doing here is we're going to have Mark and Erica hopefully talk to us a little bit about what they're seeing in terms of the dark side of the IoT. So Mark, why don't you start with your thoughts on what is the dark side of the IoT?
Okay, yeah. So the way I think we first want to talk about this is in two dimensions of dark. Dark easily is the malintent side, and the other is simply dark as in unknown. Dark as in I don't see it. I'm not aware that that data is being collected about me. It's not necessarily an evil thing or something that works against me. It's just we're finding now so many new forms of input. Right? We're used to the idea of a computer being something we hold in our hand or it's sitting in front of us on a desk and we interact with it. It's very intentional, but there are now so many modes of interaction with a computer in a home or in an office that you are more and more going to be entirely unaware of. And that opens the door to that, I think, the more common understanding of dark. It was in, okay, I'm not aware of these things going on. I'm not aware of these systems around me taking stock of what I'm doing. What's going on with that? And the scenarios, of course, are knowledge about you that you didn't intend to convey. So it's truly I think more than just technological problem, a sociological problem. We've built structures where we believe we are presenting ourselves to people in certain contexts. And now those are being thrown up in the air where we're presenting ourselves in a lot of situations where we didn't intend to, right? We're, and obviously our second guest here, her idea or her story is about being observed when you should be alone in private and the accountability that might come with that.
Can you offer an example, like in the smart home, like what that might look like, so people can kind of like, maybe we're just not thinking that way.
Yeah, so let's start with what the folks were talking about in the earlier session, which is just location. I'm in the home. I don't have to be in front of a camera now with the emerging Wi-Fi standards that allow for Wi-Fi devices to tell where I am. We can now basically map the entire home, and we can also then move that. It's more likely actually to happen in the workplace. I know all this subject is around the home, but we can create a very accurate, persistent picture of where everyone is in the home. And that obviously raises questions. Everyone listening to this is going to wonder about points in their lives where they didn't necessarily want someone to know where they were. It could be very subtle, or it could be really dramatic.
I think of things like, I'm sure everybody has had this moment where, maybe they say they're doing something else, like their spouse is away, no one's home, and they're like, oh, what are you doing? You're like, oh, I'm getting some yard work done. But really you're curled up in your bed reading, and you're like, I'll do the yard work really fast before anyone comes home and notices. I mean, that's a pretty innocent thing, but that's kind of the sort of things that we're making available to people. Yes?
Yes, absolutely. And I think the solution isn't going to be talking about how to not have these systems, but we have Wi-Fi now, and the opportunities for that on the secure side, on the positive side, are high enough that we're likely to adopt them. Maybe slower for some, maybe more aggressively for others, but the real opportunity will be installing the right policy on top of that, to where I can say at times when I'm at home, be blind to me. So it's not that I would refuse the systems, because there are going to be more and more places where that's simply impossible. It's very likely within 10 years that all retail establishments will observe all customers within that establishment. And you're going to find yourself, what, are you going to not ever go back out? No, we are going to have to, through legal and the force of commerce, maybe create systems where you can, just as much as the system's identifying you, it's identifying your preference. I'd like to be blind right now, or I'd like to be present right now, because the advantages should be there for you to both consume and control.
Okay, so in my home, I might, and when it's blind to me, I'm assuming I'm going to lose some of the kind of fun feature. I won't say fun, but some of the features that maybe I had valued. So like, if you can't see where I am in the home, then you can't turn on my lights, for example.
Right.
So that's the trade-off I'd be making.
Well, we're also forgetting that there's a wide range of people who occupy a home. If I have an elderly mother, she may very much want to be seen at one dimension. Don't watch me, but make sure the sensors can tell that I'm doing okay. Heart rate, by the way, is becoming inaccessible. It's still kind of a lab level technology, but these same radio-based sensors can detect the heart rate and the breathing rate of an occupant of a room. That's a pretty big deal. And then from there, a little bit of AI on top of that level of data, and you can start to understand how someone feels. You get sort of a gross health level indication, but you can also do things like, are they excited? Are they nervous? Are they angry? And drive all kinds of data that really changes how you might think about those systems. They're not simply presence, but disposition. So elderly people, we'd like to maybe know that they're doing okay, or children. Is a child in a place where they shouldn't be, someplace dangerous? I worked with a startup who was trying to fund a sensor array around swimming pools, so that an unattended swimming pool could be a lot safer with children in the area. So you could have a backyard and children and not risk accidental drowning. So you get very positive opportunities, but you need that layer where the other people in the backyard maybe are not being detected, because they prefer not to. It's isolated to those children, or maybe to elderly cases, or like you said, for functional advantage.
Well, in the other idea here, or a side idea here, is how well protected are these systems that are going to be deriving this information about us, and who do they belong to? So like, I might trust, for example, Taj. I know a lot about how his company works and his data works, but if it gets bought by Google, yay for Taj. But as an owner of such a system, I might those policies may change. So I guess, how do you think both consumers should think about that, and then the companies themselves, how should they communicate that to people?
I think it's difficult to talk about, because we're in a Wild West situation that's unsustainable, right? So talking about how to survive in the Wild West is not a conversation that you should continue to have over time, right? Which, just like the Wild West, did not sustain itself. It became a lot more orderly society. And here we have a lot of different players holding on to very personal data. We don't necessarily trust them, nor should we. So we talk about things like localizing the data, but I don't think that's a sustainable answer. These things have to end up in the cloud. They have to end up in unified platforms so they can make better sense, because at the same time we're talking about the security problem, we're talking about also needing enough data to make true sense of people's behavior, and that requires aggregation of a lot of that information, which means bigger players and more information. So we need both, like you described, the trust of those vendors, but I'd say we're missing one huge piece here, which is the legal infrastructure that forces those players to be more trustworthy than simply the EULAs that we hope will work out for us and we don't necessarily read.
That's so we need enough. A new sheriff in town.
We need actual law.
Okay.
We don't really have sufficient law in this space, and ideas in law. It's not just law as in how to help myself when things go really badly, but law as both kind of a shared social contract with, like, the idea that I can turn myself off in an environment, which needs to be something supported by law, but also in the social contract, and then eventually surfacing in interfaces.
Okay.
And products.
So if we stick with this Wild West idea, and hopefully it will be short-lived, the end result is we would have laws that would, or a legal framework. What are some of the ideas that should influence this legal framework? You mentioned being blind. I would kind of like to know, I would like there to be a place I can go and see what information people have about me and if it's right, or maybe I annotate it.
Yeah, it's an interesting idea, except I find the information, especially since we're talking largely about dark data, is indecipherable. So the right to see that information may never really mean enough to you. I think it's more interesting to say, I'd like the right to understand what you're doing with the information. You should have the right to control. It's likely there's so many sensors in this future. There are now, but there are an emergent number of sensors and sensing contexts that's going to be an unstoppable force. So the greater opportunities for us to control what happens with that data, because that same sensor may protect my elderly mother, is the same sensor I really want to shut off when I'm, screwing around in the house when I really should be busy. So turning on and off the sensor or working it at that level is not really reasonable.
Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
We have Erica, so I want to give her.
Welcome, Erica. We had 15 minutes of Mark. Maybe we'll do 15 minutes of Erica. Everyone, Erica Olsen, who is Director of Saftey Net at the National Network to End Domestic Violence. Hello, Erica.
Hi. So sorry for the delay. Always works on the run.
It's a tough platform.
It's
not quite Zoom.
We'll all complain about the platform for a minute, but let's talk about, Mark had really talked about this idea of the devices that we're putting into our home, collecting data that for all intents and purposes can be used to infer things about us that we don't actually have any idea about, and that can go do this throughout time. And one of the other points when we talked about the idea of dark data is the idea that people will put devices in homes with bad intent. And we thought you probably would be the person to talk more about that. But can you just summarize for people kind of what you have discovered in the last few years of researching connected devices in the home and how they're used against people in the home?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you so much for taking a moment to really pay attention to that and that aspect of technology abuse and misuse. What we know is, unfortunately, abusive individuals will use, manipulate, misuse any tools that are available to them to further their tactics of abuse. And that those tactics do include monitoring people's whereabouts, their everyday activity, monitoring their information and the things that they're doing, not just in the way of stalking to find somebody's location, but in a way to use that information to terrify people. It is pretty terrifying when somebody knows what you are wearing, when you looked up the weather, when you locked your home, what temperature you had your house set to. It is pretty terrifying when people know basic information about you. And abusers misuse these types of devices to monitor all sorts of things, to understand somebody's coming and goings, to know what they're doing, who they're with, who they might be communicating with, but also just to terrify and harass individuals, because in that context of domestic violence, knowing an abusive person, knowing just that basic information about your day-to-day implies that there's nothing you can do, that you don't have privacy, and that you can't actually leave or escape that a person's abuse. And that alone can be very terrifying. And also, and well, you ask any other questions, but it's also really used creatively, unfortunately, by abusive individuals. We've seen situations where somebody is manipulating technology that's inside someone's home, even when the survivor isn't home. So they're not doing it in a way to say, hey, I'm here, I'm watching, I'm still around, or anything like that, or to monitor them, listen to conversations. They're doing it, unfortunately, creatively, to mess with other things in the person's life, like their finances. If you crank the heat in somebody's house all day long when they're not home, and then turn it back when they're home, you're not doing it so that they know you're there, because that can take a long time for survivors to even realize that that misuse is happening. The goal there is to mess with somebody's finances so they can't afford to be in that home anymore. So we've seen really a whole bunch of types of misuse, unfortunately.
That's just, I'm like, that sucks. So what do you think? A lot of the people watching this are people who build these devices and these services and are actively involved. What would you like them to do? What are the things that can make this less awful for people and give people a sense of control, maybe?
You know, and it's a challenging thing. And I think that for the first step, I think, is to work with organizations, ours, others. There's programs all over the country that can speak to the experiences of survivors that really could look at technologies and settings and say, you know what, that's a setup for disaster, because somebody will misuse that. We know these tactics, we know what they look like. And working with programs, I think, is so helpful, because it is not unusual that if abuse isn't something that you're thinking about all the time, that many of these technologies and devices and services are originally designed with the idea that the people that we share our home with are safe individuals. And that's not a bad idea. It's just, from our perspective, unfortunately, often inaccurate. And so we can't design products from that standpoint, because it leaves survivors in a place where they're very vulnerable, and devices and services have been set up in a way that they could be easily misused. So really challenging that mindset of who should have default access, who should, likely be able to see everything we're doing right from the beginning of design, is going to be so important for safety. And thinking through, and I think, we talk a lot about privacy from design, because a lot of issues, I think, could be avoided completely if we were looking at it a little bit more from that standpoint. The other thing is that immediately comes to mind is to try to give multiple people in the home different options, user controls. And unfortunately, we have to think about, when there's a service and an account holder, so many services we've seen are set up so that the original person who bought the device, as paying for the service or set it up, they're the only one that has control over the account. And if that is something that is giving somebody access to something in the home, access to remote access to surveillance cameras, to audio from within the home, that can be a really complicated, sticky scenario, especially when that person they might even be court ordered to no longer be allowed in the home, but they still have this technological
access,
giving them access. And unfortunately, companies who didn't go into the business with wanting to think through those scenarios are going to have to think through those scenarios.
And Mark, as someone who's designed products, are y'all, I mean, do you want to take these steps? Are these terrible steps to take to start engaging people, or how?
Of course, but I don't think we have to go to even this horrific scenario that Erica's painted to realize that we need to solve for the design problem in a broader way. Every time you rent your house out, which is a much more common behavior, what was intended for you is now subjecting a guest who had no intent to be monitored in that way, and would not have access to that software. So I don't have to wait for a really abusive spouse to run into this design problem. So this goes back to where I was headed. So if we sort of swizzle a design here, right, just very loosely, any type of censored location, we need both, and this comes from, to a degree, the force of law, but common practice is what I would call the social contract in life. That I have some means of shutting it off. Now, that's not shutting the whole system off. It's shutting it off in terms of what it can do with me. Mm-hmm. Being invisible, you might say, to that environment, without having to shut it off in the physical way. Right, because it still has valuable purpose for the others in that environment, and so we would never be able to practically have that level of control. So we need individual rights to how the sensor array, what it, you might say, does with us. Let's take the interface, right? Wi-Fi today. The interface of Wi-Fi is such that it broadcasts its availability. Of course, we can shut that broadcasting part of it off. But anyone in an environment can tell there's a radio signal there, right? Mm-hmm. That we want to think of an interface at that level. I'm in a room, there are cameras looking at me. Just like Wi-Fi, can I detect that with a common application, something maybe just built into the phone? Again, I'm swizzling here, so the point being is I can understand what's being sensed about me right now, and I can make either dimensional or just a blanket denial of that sensing, and basically go about my business. Now, there's probably, given we're talking about legal protections, protections happen on both sides, right? Not just protecting me and my privacy, but there may be, like, let's say we're in a park and the park needs to know, are people there past curfew? There are going to be things that I cannot turn off. Or for safety, if someone's present but their heart stopped beating, we want to know that. So those are a layer of that technology that we probably will never be able to control. But the layer where someone can visually observe us or tell how what's going on with our heart when we're nervous, where we're walking around the house, that's a layer that has to be introduced as an interface to us individually. That's not tomorrow.
No, I think this is something actually with Project Connected Home over IP, which is one of those big standardizations, like the one ring to rule the home. I know you're talking about outside of the home, but this actually is a really important question to bring into like a standard level there. Like, mm-hmm. Erica, I'm like, I need to put you in touch with these people so they can actually bring the I'm blind. But let me ask, and we've only got 2 minutes, so I'm sorry to do this to you, but do you think something like letting a camera or putting a standard that says, hey, just don't look at me, don't pay attention to me, make my data invisible, is that a possible step that individuals can control? Is that?
Oh, are you asking me?
No, I was asking Erica. Oh, there she goes.
Yes, I'm presuming you were asking Erica.
Slight delays in this. It's a really complicated thing because for some survivors that could be extremely helpful to give them that granular control. But then there's other situations where survivors want to more shut things off or kind of turn things off. Can you hear me? It's freezing. Sorry.
That's okay. Keep going. We could hear you.
I want to make sure it's going to be a safety issue, because for some survivors who are being coerced into using some devices, trying to turn that off and make themselves hidden for a moment of time can actually raise a lot of who may demand that they answer questions on why they chose that. So
that's a tough scenario. You would have to come up with spoofing technologies to basically simulate. You know, we've all seen the spy movies where they plug in the loop of the bank when everything's fine, even though it's being robbed at the moment. But yeah, that's a fairly narrow case. I'm hoping at least for, what we have with our phones is a mute button on the side of it. And when we look at the growth of sensors in the world, we need essentially a sort of corresponding mute button to these technical environments being built around us.
Okay, I'm going to see I hear that like the cloak of invisibility is what we need. We need an invisibility cloak for
anybody watch White Christmas on the British TV show? What the hell is it called?
I was like, I do not know. I'm thinking Bing Crosby, and I don't think.
No, I know. It sounds like a fun thing. No, the one with all the negative futures, Black Mirror.
Oh.
It's the White Christmas episode that basically can take somebody and just make them not exist to others' line of sight. But you can imagine that similar phenomenon with cameras.
Okay. Well, we are, I think, a little over time, but I appreciate everybody, for one, coming to the whole event, but two, you guys for persevering through some real technical difficulties here. So thank y'all for your panel and your contributions here. Hopefully, people will now have a little bit more insight into how better to design for an age of surveillance and how to protect people who really need protection from it. Thank you all for coming, and we will have videos up after the event at staceyoniot.com/smarthome. And yes, I appreciate it. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.